All right, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning. This is KJ or Costa Jacktap here. I'm a product marketer at SafeBreach. I wanted to personally thank you for taking the time to attend our interactive session today. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. Just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded, and a recording of this webinar will be shared with all the attendees and the registrants either later today or tomorrow, depending on the video processing. At any given point of time, if you guys have any questions about the content or the SafeBreach product, please send them to us via the Q&A function on your screen. And we shall be answering all the questions live during the Q&A session towards the end. With that being said, let's go ahead and get started. As you all know, Verizon releases an annual DBIR or data breach investigations report annually. And this 2022 version of this report highlighted that ransomware threats actually increased in 2021 at a pace that was higher than the last 5 years combined, which is a telling fact. And given the ransomware's ability to effectively exploit and monetize illegal access to private information, there is a growing need for organizations to understand their level of risk and how can they protect themselves by implementing a proactive approach to defending themselves. A good way of defending organizations against the threat of ransomware is to proactively run ransomware assessments that can provide your security team with the ability to understand the efficacy of your current security controls, identify those gaps, reduce your overall risk, make the right sourcing decisions, spending decisions, and support alignment across different teams or different segments in your security operations center. With that being said, today's interactive webinar will highlight how organizations can successfully run a ransomware assessment using the SafeBreach platform. I was originally going to share the agenda, but Derek reached out to me earlier and said that we should change things up a bit. Derek will start the webinar by sharing with the audience the parameters of the assessment, and we'll actually start the assessment, and then we'll switch back to the slides. What this will allow us to do is this will allow us to explain the methodology behind the assessment while the assessment is running in the back. And that way, once the slides are done, the assessment should be complete, and Derek can walk you through the results of the assessment and the key outcomes. With that being said, I know I jumped forward, and I'm going to jump back. I just want to introduce our speaker, Derek. Derek is SafeBreach's senior security services director. He's a veteran security architect with over 20 years of information security experience. Currently, Derek leads the development of various value-added services, just like the ransomware assessment for our customers and the overall broader security community. So over to you, Derek.
Good morning, good afternoon. So wanted to start with what we're testing today. We have 2 ransomware assessments available. The one we're running today is the quick and easy version. It utilizes one Windows simulator. It runs in under 30 minutes, but provides a nice view of where you sit from a ransomware perspective. Behaviors we'll be testing include credential access, persistence, defense evasion, discovery, all leading to lateral movement. And this is the precursor to ransomware execution. I'm going to jump in to the assessment. We're going to kick it off. This is the assessment itself. It's done in a kill chain fashion. We start off with some network propagation. We're looking at command and control and some of the covert activity that happens with communication channels. We're going to do some malware transfer across the perimeter, as well as typical impact from a ransomware perspective, such as modifying the shadow copies and shutting down services before ransomware is launched. We're going to inject malware into memory and then execute some of the ransomware that's available in platform today. So let's kick this off. All right, the assessment's starting. Now let's talk about why we're testing what we're testing. starting with the unified kill chain, and this is really a good visual of what an attacker or an adversary is doing on network, how they start with an initial foothold. Generally, it's delivery, social engineering, email, spear phishing is still one of the biggest entry points today. They exploit something, could be a vulnerability, could be a macro, a way to gain that initial foothold. And once they're there, they rarely land where they want to be. So they establish this foothold with communication. Most of these attacks today are interactive hands-on keyboards attacks. They establish persistent and almost all cases, some sort of defense evasion. Generally, discovery comes very quickly. Credential access most of the time. There are other ways to laterally move without credentials, but credentials are a really stealthy way to move around the network. Backup servers, domain controllers, file servers are really juicy targets. Once they start propagating across the network, there are decent detection opportunities throughout the kill chain. And the earlier in the kill chain we detect and respond, the better. Stopping lateral movement should be a key focus, or at least detecting it. Once they access multiple devices, create C2 and persistence on several devices, which is often the case, and root themselves into your network, it gets way more difficult to evict the attacker. Let's talk a little bit about persistent threats, right? Almost all ransomware threats are persistent threats. There's dwell time on network, right? And they want to stay on network to accomplish their goals. Ransom gangs are opportunistic first and foremost, but on occasion, they can target certain organizations. Defense evasion or flying under the radar is the goal of these living off the land and fileless attacks, often utilizing whitelisted admin utilities such as WMIC, C-script, VB-script, PowerShell, etc. SMB is a big one, but also using a lot of common administrative tools and pen testing tools. AD Find is a tool that is scripted often and utilized to query Active Directory and get all the information they need to continue to move forward with their attack. PS Exec is a legitimate administrative tool in which most of your anti-malware or EPP products are not going to stop PS Exec from running, but it's utilized pretty consistently. Cobalt Strike and other pen testing tools are often utilized as well. Some of the tools that I don't have listed here, but are utilized are things like AnyDesk. They're remote management tools, but they're used nefariously by these ransomware actors. Let's talk a little bit about nation states and the methodology that it uses. From this perspective, this is the SolarWinds attack. Other than the novel way in which they gained network access, once they went to hands-on keyboard, it was a pretty straightforward attack. They used Cobalt Strike beacons for command and control and some lateral movement. They did discovery using AD Find and admin utilities. They used a tool called Mimikatz to do an LSAS dump and grab credentials. SMB to move around the network, scheduled tasks. They established persistence with the goal of getting admin privileges. And once that happened in one of two ways, they moved their hands-on keyboard attack to the cloud, which was their ultimate goal, was data exfiltration in the cloud. Looking at a ransomware attack, this is kind of an eye chart, I realize, but this particular ransomware attack was less than 4 hours from initial access to ransomware execution. The initial access was a malware called Iced ID. It's sent usually by email. It will do discovery in an automated fashion, as well as establish persistence with a scheduled task. Once that happens, and in this case, about 2 hours later, the hands-on keyboard initiated, the attack initiated. They started with injecting Cobalt Strike into a process. They did domain and network discovery using AD Find. In this case, it's a batch file. They used NSLookup batch file or script as well to automate some of that discovery. They did an LSAS dump to grab credentials. They used Cobalt Strike in this case. They tested those credentials, then laterally moved via RDP to several servers, dropped another Cobalt Strike beacon, further rooting themselves. In this case, the first Cobalt Strike beacon failed, but they used PowerShell on the second go and were successful. They then RDP'd to other servers in the environment, domain controllers and file servers, staged their ransomware via the domain controller, used admin shares, so hidden shares via SMB to transfer it, and then executed it with WMIC and PS exec. Very similar to what was happening with the nation state attack. And the lesson learned here really is the line between criminal gangs and nation states is very blurry. The methodology is the same, the behaviors are similar, tools are similar, and most case commodity. This really started in around 2013 when the criminal gangs started adopting this living off the land methodology and thought process. And really what separates the nation states from the criminal gangs is their motivations. Defense evasion versus financial, time on target for espionage versus speed. Ransomware gangs want to get paid. But the idea here is we're up against a lot of behavior on these attacks. In a ransomware attack, it's not just the malware we need to be worrying about. It's all the things that happen before the malware. A little bit of economics on a ransomware attack. It's a very low cost to an attack. With ransomware as a service, which is most of the services that are out there, taking care of the infrastructure, it's really on the affiliates to find that initial access. They can spend their time to scan, brute force, or spearfish for initial access, or they can buy access. The price can be low either way, but even your time has a cost. And if you buy access relatively inexpensive, you can do more of these attacks and get paid more often. Several gangs have been approaching insiders of an organization and offering $1 million or more to help facilitate a ransomware attack. They also have been social engineering insiders and kind of coaxing them, eventually gaining initial access. So even the traditional initial accesses are starting to change a little bit. Experienced and successful affiliates will save the time, buy that access, and hit a lot more targets. On average, around 46% of victims paid the ransom in the first quarter of 2022. And with the low cost of an attack and the huge ransoms being asked, you can really kind of see the profit potential here. The only way to stop ransomware is to not pay the ransom, so that the operations are no longer profitable. Taking a look at the landscape, Coveware has a unique view of the market. Their business is ransomware incident response and negotiations. At a glance, you can kind of see how these various RAS services change quarter to quarter. Most of the time, it's affiliates using these RAS services, so these service providers that run tighter operations flourish. New players are continually entering the market. The good news is we are starting to win the war here a little bit. Criminals are not keeping their promises, surprise, surprise. There is a fair amount of victim intelligence shared amongst the criminals. Paying the ransom has consequences. A Cyber Reason ransomware survey found that nearly 80% of victims that pay were victims of a second attack. 68% of victims that paid were hit a second time in less than a month for a higher ransom. Two priorities to focus on here. Really breaking the attack kill chain very early. And we do that with detecting malicious behavior such as discovery, credential theft, defense evasion, or the combination thereof. Detecting behavior is an absolute must, but not all detections are an alert. It's the correlation of multiple behaviors that lead to malicious intent that will minimize alert fatigue. Response and recovery is not as easy as it may appear. Practice your incident response and crisis management to develop muscle memory. Identify the information needed, possible technical issues, who is responsible to respond, align management and decision-making, and clarify the communications. Understand the order to bring systems back online and account for dependencies of the various systems. Practice and test your recovery strategy, including bringing systems back online from scratch, and make sure your backups cannot be encrypted or deleted. Architecture and a proper backup system go a long way to help this. Let's jump back into the live assessment. and see where we sit. So we're trucking right along here, and we can jump into the current summary and take a look at a high level of our progress. And you can see some of the ports and protocols that are exploited and the top 5 attack types that have been missed so far. We can go in and take a look at results at a high level. This allows us to see what was missed, go in and look at it. In this case, it was Black Boston malware. It allows us to see big picture views of ports and protocols that were tested. We also have a MITRE ATT&CK heat map view. With MITRE ATT&CK, it allows us to really get a feel for the areas that we're not doing well. And finally, we have the dashboard view. And before I jump into the dashboard, let me just spend a minute to talk about how we came up with these ransomware assessments. For the most part, there was a lot of research done on the most prolific ransomware groups. We brought in as much threat intelligence as possible. We really went through that intelligence, the TTPs, the behaviors that were prevalent across all of the ransomware groups, and correlated all of that into these assessments. Heavily behavior-based to try and really build out that sense of what happens in a real ransomware attack and be able to help customers and clients go in, test these particular behaviors, even one at a time, create detections to be able to correlate those detections into alerts and be able to detect attacks as they need to be. When we go into the dashboard and we start to break down the data, you can see at a high level your overall status. There was 236 simulations run, 75 behavior types, as well as 32 MITRE techniques and 28 sub-techniques. We would list the kill chain here in how we tested, and then we start to break down the areas. In this case, there's infiltration, so that's the transfer of malware across the perimeter. You get a breakdown of where you sit at a high level. The simulations that were behavioral based, host-based simulations themselves, you also see the number and the breakdown of what that looks like. This becomes important because you can see your weak areas. You can start to understand your gaps and understand the areas to focus on so you can get better at defending against these attacks. We also have a breakdown of the command and control and the tests that we ran, so you get a big picture view of that as well. So looking at the perimeter, there's a lot that happens and there's a lot of opportunity to tighten your controls. Going a little further, we list out all of the simulations that we ran across the perimeter as far as malware transfer. And you get a big picture view. It's all broken out of what we run and what that looks like. And again, you can kind of take a look at your weak areas and focus on some remediation and tighten up your security controls. From here, we look at the behavioral activities. And in general, what you're going to find is a lot of your discovery, the things that are really in and of themselves, by themselves, innocuous. It's an IP config. It's these commands that are run that one by one, they're not malicious at all. It's when they happen in sets. Like when we looked at the iced ID, there was about 10 commands run to do initial discovery, right? And when you put all of that together, that is at the very least extremely suspicious and really leaning towards malicious, and it's reconnaissance. And so when you start to break this dashboard down and look at the areas where you're weak, discovery is generally a big part of that area. But creating and starting a service, you can see we did pretty well. Extracting credentials, we missed one. It's an area that we can take a look at and see if we can tighten up because it's in the registry itself, which means a query was done. We should be able to detect that query and at the very least add that to our correlation to understand if we have a bigger problem. Things of that nature, when you start to really drill into the details here, help you understand your weak areas and how to get better. As we go further down, we then went to the execution. In this case, we did pre-execution of injecting various malware into memory, as well as executing some of the ransomware specifically. When we did pre-execution, it is a real payload. It actually gets injected in the memory, but it stops short of actually executing it, so that you exercise your endpoint protection product, but you're doing it in a very safe way. The way we execute the actual ransomware is we create a folder, we bring in a bunch of files, and then we use the behavior of ransomware in the correct crypto, as well as keys, the way that it does the encryption, and we simulate that behavior of these various ransomwares so that that behavior is there, and you can see if your endpoint protection product or policies can pick that up. Taking a look, you can see we did fairly well. All of our pre-execution looks to have been stopped. Most of our ransomware execution was stopped, doing pretty good. And to kind of talk about this test environment a little bit, there's a Palo Alto firewall that's been tuned pretty good using the SafeBreach platform, as well as Sentinel-1 on the endpoint agent. This is a single Windows device, and it has a simulator on it. And this particular dashboard comes from that environment. Moving on to command and control, this is where it gets kind of interesting. One of the things I learned as a SafeBreach client, and I was a client for SafeBreach 2 different times since 2017, is there's no way to stop data exfil. And what I mean by that is when you look at this HTTP GET, you're never ever going to stop an HTTP GET. But there's a way to, you basically put a question mark on the end of a GET, and you can add whatever data you want. You can obfuscate it. There's ways to add lots of information. You often see it with advertising links where there'll be question mark, they'll have a whole bunch of stuff, and then it maybe clicks over to a new page. Because it's a GET and you're never going to stop a GET, you can pretty much put whatever information you want there and send it out. So when you really think about it from that aspect, there's no way to stop data exfil. We really need to focus earlier in the kill chain, right? And when you look at what ransomware gangs are doing, the Conti leaks were very revealing. They spent a lot of time modifying their ransomware executables to ensure that they bypass security controls. And in most cases, tested their ransomware on a test device before they moved it across the entire network to launch it. This is something that happens pretty consistently. So you really want to get better at catching these things early in the kill chain, understanding when you have network connections that maybe shouldn't be going out, especially from a command and control and interactive perspective, and really start to see how you can tune your security controls tighter. Moving on, we break down all of the MITRE techniques that we tested, and we give you a status breakdown, right? Again, you can start to take a look from a technique perspective of where you sit. All of these are clickable. You can go in to the system itself. Go up here, jump in, and it pulls up the details, for instance, of the behavioral actions that were missed, right? A lot of system information dump. We got scheduled task here, persistence, something we saw, script execution. There's various attacks. The details are here. You can start to really get a feel for where you're lacking and put some mitigations in place. And then you can one by one test these if need be to test your detection or mitigation to ensure you're getting better as you move along. Coming back down, we'll go into the actual techniques themselves. You can see there's a lot of discovery here. This is something that we run in our ransomware assessments and several other assessments that we run. It's one of the weak areas where, because most of these in and of themselves, these commands are not malicious, they're not really alerted on. So understanding if you have telemetry, the ability, a log of some sort, the ability to see it so you can build a detection on it becomes important. It happens very early in the kill chain, and it's a great way to detect an attack in progress. Credential dumping and how we did, some of the other capabilities, impairing defenses, stopping services, querying the registry. Many of these are very detectable. It's just a matter of understanding the behavior, creating the detection so you can correlate those detections. As we move down, we also have MITRE sub techniques. This is kind of interesting because we break it down even tighter, right? Windows command shell. So these were actually opening up a command prompt and running commands. Security software discovery, looking for what your endpoint protection product is, and other means of discovery. LSAS memory dump actually did pretty good here, etc. On down the line. And with this breakdown, you really start to get a feel for where you sit, where your weak spots are, some of your gaps, so you can start to think about how do we get better. And finally, with this particular ransomware assessment, we offer some mitigation and some remediation guidance. We offer it at the network level. We also talk about host level recommendations, as well as privilege account management and some of the things you can do to tighten your security controls to minimize the impact of lateral movement, of credential abuse, and how to start to tighten up from a policy perspective even to mitigate some of these attacks. And then we also have a little bit of the business continuity and disaster recovery remediation guidance included. So that's a high-level overview of a ransomware attack, what we tested, why we tested it, and what you get from a report or detailed perspective if you decided to run a ransomware assessment, and how it can help you start to move the needle towards protecting yourself better. So from there, are there any questions?
Thank you again, Derek, for taking the time. As I mentioned earlier, please use the Q&A function in your Zoom webinar to share any questions. We do actually have a couple of questions here. First question here is, how does this tool compare to the CISA Ransomware Readiness Assessment CSET version 10.3?
The US cert like CISA?
Yeah, CISA. Yeah.
Honestly, I haven't taken a look at that tool. So I don't know the exact comparison. I can tell you a little bit about SafeBreach and our ability to take various simulations that are in platform and do exactly what we did to hand build a kill chain based assessment and do that in a way that allows us to really get a view, as well as pull the data out in a very prescriptive way. I'll take a look at that CSET tool, and that way, if this question comes up again, I'll be able to answer it a little better. But sorry about that.
The second question from the same person was, how long does it take to configure the assessment?
These assessments are pre-configured and ready to go. We can send you a file, you import the file, select your simulators, and off you go. This particular assessment we can do as not a customer. We can set up some time with you. We'll help you install a simulator, help you configure they would call it an impersonated user. It's a test user, so we can test your user policies against some of these behaviors and kick this thing off. And then we'll come back with a report very similar to this and go through that report with you to help you understand where you sit and some of the things you can do to get better.
Thank you. The next question here is, if the simulation was run against a single machine, how did it test lateral movement?
So in this case, the lateral movement that we're testing is agentless lateral movement and some of the things that happen at the endpoint themselves. So I can go back to the test results if you'd like, but we have some SMB via a remote code execution, lateral movement. We have lateral movement via RDP. It's trying to see if it can go out and make a connection. And in this case, it couldn't. Therefore, we were able to stop that. Lateral movement from the perspective of malware transfer in this particular assessment, we don't test. It's designed to be the quick and easy and give you that big picture overview, a really nice view. The ransomware assessment we have that has more depth actually does test full lateral movement, malware transfer, and other lateral movement behaviors, as well as it has more depth and breadth of all of the testing you saw here. So if you wanted a deeper dive ransomware assessment, It would be something that we offer our customers. It's something that we offer as a paid assessment, or if you wanted to run, let's say, a POV or engage the sales team, it's something we can help with in that arena too.
You. The next question is this assessment ransomware specific, or can we run other sorts of assessments with this, or do you offer other sorts of assessments?
Absolutely. So this particular assessment is ransomware specific. There was a lot of research done to really pull out the behaviors, the typical way an attack happens, what it really looks like from an attacker's perspective to create this. But we do have other types of assessments. We do EDR bake-offs or EPP bake-offs, have done several of those. We can look at your firewall controls, both infiltration and exfiltration, egress filtering. We have the ability to test a multitude of capabilities. We actually have a MITRE ATT&CK top 16 assessment where we'll run the top 16 TTPs covered from 2019 to 2021. It basically covers 90% of the attacks of that data that was pulled. So it's being able to take a relatively small number of techniques and sub-techniques and cover 90% of attacks. This is, again, from a 2-year period, but it's indicative of what's happening today as well. And get the most bang for your effort is ideal. So we have numerous assessments that can be run in platform or as paid assessments if you just want a one-time kind of deal, and we're capable of running all of those and more.
Next question is, can the SafeBreach tool be used to perform a firewall audit?
Absolutely. Actually, as a client, that was one of the first things that I did is I used SafeBreach to certify my next-gen firewall, to go in and test it, tune it, and understand its operations so I can build the architecture around it so we could deploy fully within a large Fortune 70 organization.
Thank you. The next question that we have here is, are you using real payloads during the ransomware assessment?
The payloads are real. So for pre-execution, it is a real ransomware payload injected in the memory. We do so with a debugging capability, and we stop short of actually executing it. So it gets injected in the memory, and just before execution, we stop so that we can exercise your endpoint protection product efficiently and effectively. As far as the malware transfer, those are real payloads as well. This thoroughly tests your perimeter device.
Thank you. That's about all the questions that we received. So thank you again, Derek, for taking the time to walk us through this live assessment. Again, I want to thank each and every attendee who took time out of their day to watch us do this live assessment. Again, at any given point of time, if you have any questions after this webinar, obviously about the product, about the assessment, please go to our website and request additional information. We will be in touch with you right away. As a reminder, as the session was being recorded, we will share the recording of this presentation and the session, obviously the video, with you after after the video is processed later today or early tomorrow. This webinar will also be available on our website as probably a YouTube video that you can just click and run, that you can share with any other coworkers or anyone else who might be interested in viewing this webinar. Again, thank you everyone, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Have a wonderful.
Thank you.